John Milnes Baker is an award-winning architect who specializes in residential design. He was a 2018 recipient of the Albert Nelson Marquis Lifetime Achievement Award by Marquis' Who's Who in America as a leader in the field of architecture. A fine arts graduate of Middlebury College, Baker received his master's degree in architecture from Columbia University. A longtime member of the American Institute of Architects, Mr. Baker is a member of the Society of Architectural Historians and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He is the author of How to Build a House with an Architect, Harper and Row, 1988, and American House Styles, A Concise Guide, first published in 1994 by W. Norton, but reprinted in expanded edition in 2018. When Better Homes and Gardens magazine Home Plan Ideas featured their 10 most popular houses of all time, 3 of them were Baker's designs, including, quote, our readers' flexible all-time favorite, which they described as one of the most universally accepted houses they had ever featured. Mr. Baker continues to lecture on the history of the American house and continues to consult with residential clients as an emeritus member of the AIA.
John Milnes Baker here. I want to welcome you to my 4-part program. Thanks to the Connecticut chapter of the AIA, I'm able to expand the scope of my book, American House Styles, A Concise Guide, by showing examples of actual buildings that are representative of the myriad styles under consideration. I hope you enjoy the series and find the subject as fascinating as I do. So let's get started. It's from the founding of the British colonies in North America through the early colonial period to the end of the Stuart monarchy. So 1603 to 1715. Then we pick up from 1715 to 1783. That's from the beginning of the Georgian era, with the coronation of the first George, to the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. And I won't read them all, but you'll see that we're going to go on to part 2, part 3, part 4. And I hope you'll all tune in for that. I use the term buoys of history. Dates of critical historical events are the equivalent of navigational buoys. Without these markers, one cannot place cultural changes in a historical context. And I'm starting with 1607 because Jamestown was founded in Virginia, and it was the first permanent settlement in British North America. I won't read them all, but they go on through 1609, when the Hudson River was discovered by Henry Hudson. The Mayflower landed in 1620, and so on. These are all on the site, and they're all actually listed in my book, if anyone ever wants to see that. But these are very, very important dates, and I refer to them, as I say, as buoys of history. Every front elevation shown in the following illustrations are reproduced from my book, American House Styles, A Concise Guide. That's the second edition. It was published in 2018, although the first edition has been in print and still available after 25 years. But they all develop from the same basic partie. The same basic floor plan is modified for each style illustrated. And I state in the preface of my book, stylistic embellishments of American houses have tended to be superficial veneers that often veiled inventive floor plans and common sense designs for new American living patterns. The content, as distinct from the style, was apt to be more innovative than one might suppose at first glance. The difference between style and content, between the clothes and the person, is obviated by the use of the same basic house plan throughout this guide. And that, of course, will be through this talk. 1603 was a very important buoy of history. Elizabeth I was the last of the Tudors. She died in 1603, and James Stuart, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England, and it was the beginning of the Stuart era. James I's reign was also called the Jacobean era. Jamestown was founded in 1607. The Mayflower landed in 1620. The first George ascended the throne in 1715. So no building built before that can be considered Georgian. So we're starting now with part 1, 1607 to 1715. From the founding of the British colonies in North America through the early colonial period to the end of the Stuart monarchy in 1714, followed by the Georgian period in 1715 with the coronation of George I. So then following this will be 1715 to 1783, from the beginning of the Georgian era to the coronation of the first George to the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. So the first real style is the early New England colonial. It goes from about 1620 or 30 to 1715. And here's a wonderful quote. By and large, Renaissance architects promoted that unity of creative expression in any given country and period that we call style. That was Hugh Morrison in a wonderful book published in 1953 called Early American Architecture. Now, looking at this building, this is the first, the massing is rectilinear, often with cross gables, massive chimneys in the center of the structure, steeply pitched gable ends. English prototypes were thatched, but wood shakes in New England. The entrance door was vertical boards, usually flush, rarely beaded, and often with decorative or geometric nail pattern. Very plain trim. Fenestration was typically small casement, diamond pane, leaded glass, although the Parson Capon house panes were rectangular, which was rather unusual at the time. Wooden sash windows were later replacements in the 1700s. Clapboard or beveled or square-edged weatherboards, occasionally shingles. The details, the massive central chimneys, usually stone, though sometimes brick, with clustered flues and decorative patterns. No fancy decoration except sometimes drops under the jetted overhangs. You can see that little sketch I made over on the lower right. The floor plans typically I-plan, so-called hall and parlor plan. The layouts were often expanded with an addition of one story shed, creating the characteristic salt box. Later salt boxes were created from scratch. Sash windows were often refitted in original 17th century houses. On the upper left there, you see that's a picture that was taken at Plymouth Plantation. And it recreates, as best they could, about 1625. So the first building on the right there, upper right, is the Parson Capon house. It was in the mid-17th century, and you can see the plan below it shows the typical hall and parlor I-plan, and even though it's set in where the stairway is, they called it a porch. And on the lower left is a building in Suffolk, England, that I took a few years ago, and it shows exactly the same kind of structure that was built in the early houses in New England, because that's where most of the early settlers came from. The vast majority of them were from East Anglia. On the upper left is Hawthorne's House of Seven Gables in Salem, Mass. It was built in about 1670. And on the right is the Saugus Ironworkers House, and that was built about 1645. The lower left is the Corwin House in Salem, Mass. It was called the Witch's House. And the lower right is actually on Long Island in Cutchogue, way out on the North Fork. It's called the Old House. The salt boxes were common in England. There's a picture of one in Essex. Essex was also part of East Anglia, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, with the main bump out into the North Sea. The Fairbanks House is 1636. It was originally, the lean-to shed was added to the original I plan, creating a salt box. The other two ends were later additions. On the lower left is an early house, 1639, the Whipple House in Ipswich. And if you note on the picture on the right, the addition of the salt box shed roof. In the later 1600s, salt boxes were built with the shed part of the initial design with much shallower roof pitch. The slope of the roof was then in the same plane. House on Nantucket, that's a little later, 1670s or 80s, the Jethro Coffin House. The Hoxie House, the salt box on the right, was about 1675, and you can see that on the lower right is a picture of the fireplace detail. The other house on the lower left is the Putnam Cottage in Greenwich, Connecticut. It became the Knapp's Tavern, and it was a little later, it was about 1690. But, and note the shingles. That was a bit unusual at that time in New England. Mostly they were clapboard. But Hoxie House was shingles as well. Here we have an interesting house, and it's peculiar to Rhode Island. They were called stone enders. This is a picture of the Arnold House. It was about 1680 something in Lincoln, Rhode Island. The entire end wall of these stone enders were built of stone. In spite of the small windows, due to the cost of imported glass and the frugality that dictated the character of this starkly simple structure, much effort was invested in the elaborate clustered chimney mass. It's interesting, and you see the detail of the chimney mass. The lower left is the Henry Whitfield House. That was dated from about 1639 or 40, and it's a rare example of a masonry late medieval structure in New England. It's beautifully preserved and it's open to the public. I encourage anyone to go and look at it. The Peck House in Watertown was a small 1.5-story house clad with shingles. And note that they're really teeny tiny windows. Now we come to the early Southern Colonial, and I still put the rough date overall of 1607 simply because it puts it in a historical context. But the characteristics of this are rectilinear, often with cross gables, substantial chimney, but they're at the gable ends, often separated from the building by several inches. Climate was very different down there, and they wanted to let heat escape rather than saving it for the heat through our winters. The roof type was steeply pitched gable ends. English prototypes were thatched and sometimes in grander houses, slate. Vertical boards, the entrance, usually plush, rarely beaded, but often the doors were decorated with the geometric nail patterns. Again, casing very, very simple. Typically small casement windows with diamond panes, leaded glass, and any wood sash, single or double hung windows were later replacements. Typically surviving examples were brick, but sometimes clapboard and rarely shingles. The chimneys were sometimes stone and more commonly brick with clustered flues and decorative patterns. And see the sketch in the next slide of the gable end of Bacon's Castle. But the floor plan, again, was typically I-plan, so-called hall and parlor. And note that southern houses rarely have salt boxes as a standard convention, and the odd examples were referred to as cat slides. The Thorogood House in Virginia Beach was about 1680, and it's a beautifully preserved example. You see the massive chimney on the outside. There are two other buildings that date from the early days as well, both the Newbold White House near Virginia Beach. And then the Lynn Haven in Virginia Beach also, which is late 17th century. And most of the surviving 17th century houses were brick, and most wood houses today are reconstructions. Now we're back to New England from about 1715, 1783. And this is from the end of the Stuart reign and the beginning of the Georgian period to the Treaty of Paris, the official end of the Revolutionary War. A typical salt box is shown here with the center chimney, but now the chimneys are smaller than the ones seen in the 17th century examples, and they no longer feature the decorative clustered flues. The typical characteristics, the massing is rectilinear, usually with central chimneys at the center of the structure, but later the center hall plan evolved. We'll look at that in a minute. The roof type, less steeply pitched roofs, wooden shake, most common roofing material. The panel doors now with simple flat surrounds, sometimes with a rectilinear transom light, but still with simple square edge casing. Fenestration, typically wooden sash windows. Muntins were about an inch thick, various patterns, 6/6, 6/9, or 9/6. These houses generally were never painted, so often seen in colonial revival houses. And there were no shutters. Materials clapboard for the most part in New England, but occasionally shingles. Chimneys, stone or brick, but no fancy patterns or clustered flues. Typically the floor plans square, rectilinear on the first floor, and the salt boxes were now generally built in this form from the very beginning. Here's some houses. This is Home Sweet Home on the upper left. It was a house in East Hampton, Long Island. It was a little later. It was probably a little after 1715. But then the Mulford house right behind it, right behind Home Sweet Home, was about the same period, maybe a little earlier, in fact. And then lower left is an interesting house. It's in Hingham, Mass. And note the bow roof. The roof rafters were curved slightly. And there's some talk that a lot of them were built by shipwrights. And of course, the decking beams on ships were bowed like that. And then on the right in Darien, Connecticut, a typical 18th century salt box. Now we're moving along in the standard 5-bay single pile house. But and you can see the plan, the chimneys have moved to the right and to the left, and it's a center hall colonial. This is standard for double pile houses, where the second story is the same size as the ground floor, so they had 4 bedrooms on the upper level. The house on the right, the red one, is a museum house in Wilton, Connecticut, and below that in Litchfield, Connecticut, typical 5-bay center hall colonial. And note the modest chimneys. Now we're talking about Georgian colonial, as opposed to simply colonial. Queen Anne was the last of the, I'm repetitive, but it's important to establish these buoys of history. Queen Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs. She died in 1714 and was succeeded by George I. And he was the grandfather of George III, who was king during the American Revolution. This section covers the period from the beginning of the Georgian era, with the coronation of the first George, to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which, as I said, officially ended the Revolutionary War. The 2 important forces influenced the architecture of the 18th century. One, the Dutch influence in the late 17th century, and Palladio's influence on English and subsequently American colonial architecture. And again, I quote from my book: to understand Georgian architecture, one must know something about Andrea Palladio, who lived from 1518 to 1580, who was undoubtedly one of the most influential architects of all time. He was a native of Vicenza. His country houses inland from Venice were unlike anything that had been built before. They inspired generations of architects, dilettantes, and scholars. His innovations became gospel for British architects from Inigo Jones and Sir Christopher Wren in the 17th century through the Georgian era of the 18th century. His influence was felt in American colonies and is still felt today, even if in vestigial form. Now, this is Southern pre-Georgian. This is, you can call it Stuart or Restoration. They talk about Restoration drama. Well, it's the same era. Now, Williamsburg was established in 1699 by settlers from Jamestown. This was toward the end of the Stuart dynasty, and although these buildings share many classical features, they should, with the later Georgian, they are not and should not be called Georgian. Queen Anne was the last of the Stuarts, and she died in 1714. Holland had a strong influence on English architecture during this period. Mary Stuart married William III, the son of Mary and William of Orange. The royal court actually moved to Holland during the Commonwealth, and Dutch architecture contributed to the sense of domesticity and the warmth of gently scaled houses. And I highly recommend Witold Wojcinski's book, Home, A Short History of an Idea. You can see Brafferton Hall at William and Mary College. And this was during the Stuart dynasty. It's helpful to remember that James VI of Scotland became James I of England upon the death of Queen Elizabeth I. James was succeeded by his son Charles in 1625. He was beheaded in 1549, and Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth was a ruling body until Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660. This was the age of Sir Christopher Wren, 1632 to 1723, who flourished during the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire of London in 1666. Charles II was succeeded briefly by his brother James II. He was a rabid Catholic and he was deposed in 1688 by the so-called Glorious Revolution. Then William and Mary ruled until Mary died in 1694 and William alone until 1702. He was followed by Queen Anne, who was the last of the Stuart line. Now on the next slide, you'll see a building. This is Castle Duvenvoorde in the province of South Holland. The building took its final form about 1631. Note the sash windows, that's a double hung. The steeply pitched hip roof, the white stone surrounds with louvered blinds. We call them shutters here generally, but they're really blinds. These features had a strong influence on the English architecture of the late Stuart period and subsequently on the residential architecture of the American colonial era. So let's look at a couple of Palladian buildings. On the upper left is probably Palladio's most famous building. It's Villa Capra or Villa Rotunda, and it's inland from Venice. It was built in 1556 to 1570. It was a very long period. And you can see on the right, Chiswick, Lord Burlington's house in Middlesex, which is really very near Ealing. It's part of Greater London now. And that was built as sort of an entertainment place. He had other manors and estates. And then in the lower left, you'll see Monticello, which is Jefferson's own house, and you can see the dome echoing the character of the Palladio's Villa Capra. And then on the right, you'll see Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, all very much influenced by Palladio. And what are the characteristics of Palladio? Let's have a look at the next slide. And on the left, you'll see the lower part of that is a drawing of Tulip Hill. It's in Anne Arundel County, not far from a little south of Annapolis. And the five-part, the top one is a view of Villa Baydor, 1556, and it emphasizes and shows the five-part composition, very characteristic of the. So let's look at what else have we gained from Palladio. So next slide shows on the upper left, Villa Cornaro is probably one of Palladio's most influential designs. And you can see on the right, Shirley is in Charles City County in Virginia. It was about 1723, very early for that. And on the upper right is the Bruton House, 1765 in Charleston, South Carolina. Lower left, Villa Pisani, 1550s. And on the right, Drayton Hall, Charleston, South Carolina. And then some more about Palladio, because it's important. Upper left, Villa Saraceno. It was built in 1550. And next to it on the right, another Villa Emo. That was the late 1550s. And lower left, Mount Airy in Richmond County, Virginia. And you can see where it echoes the three arches there. And then on the right, I show a typical Palladian window. And there are really five major innovations from Palladio that are very, very important to note. One is the five-part composition. The other is the central pediment on the main facade, emphasizing the importance of the main entrance. Third, the introduction of the dome in a residential building. It was always associated with pagan temples and not residential work. It's almost like putting a steeple on top of a Cape Cod cottage or something. And then the introduction of the dome, and then the use of a relatively mundane stucco as a finished material rather than the coarse stone or masonry of the palazzos of Rome and Florence. And of course, the last would be the Palladian window, which was also called the Venetian window. So you'll see all of these five major influences, but it wasn't just it was more than that. It was actually, he codified the orders. There were five orders, but really the Corinthian and the composite were very, very similar at first glance. So these are from my book, and they just illustrate that all of the proportions are based on the diameter at the lower end of the base, and I arbitrarily used 18 inches. So that's how all of those proportions would be shaped. And this is true of all neoclassical architecture, as we'll see later, but certainly the influence on Thomas Jefferson. Next slide also shows something that's near and dear to my heart. If you look at the two drawings, details on the upper left, the Cyma recta molding, which is the crown molding at the top. And it's the only place the crown molding should be positioned. Note the crown molding, the Cyma recta, follows up the rake above the upper part of the split or hinged fillet and not on the lower part just above the horizontal corona. Though you often see the lower detail there, it's flat and uninteresting when compared to the correct classical standard. It places the emphasis on the horizontal portion of the pediment rather than on the rake. Now, Asher Benjamin was an immensely important writer, architect, but he published his book, and though admittedly not all that clearly, in his 1827 edition of the American Builder's Companion, he stated, "It is to be observed that the cyma recta and the fillet above it of the cornice are always omitted in the horizontal one of the pediment, that part of the pediment being directed upward to finish the inclined cornices, unquote. Though somewhat verbose, the author is specific in his instruction that the S-shaped crown molding, the cyma recta, caps the top of the pediment and is not returned on the horizontal. So now let's look at the next slide, which is the Georgian in 1715 to 1783 in New England. And this is from the end of the Stuart monarchy and the first Hanoverian, George I, to the end of the whole colonial era. So I've forgotten, Hugh Morrison, again, in 1952, in his book, Early American Architecture, said the Georgian, with its formal symmetry and finer materials and delicately executed ornament, was the expression of a wealthy and polite society. Well, the massing of these two-story double pile with center hall, 5-bay most common, fireplaces either centered back to back or sometimes 4 chimneys on exterior walls, but within the structure, not bumping out. The roof types could be any number of configurations, gable, gambrel, or hipped, and even mansard, often with a balustrade, which I show in my little drawing there. The entrance door is always paneled with classical surround, classical pediments common, either triangular, rounded, or sometimes with a broken pediment. Rectangular transom lights, but sometimes round, but never elliptical. There's one exception to that. In the Bruton House in Charleston, South Carolina, there's a fan light, and that's the only one, according to Hugh Morrison, very respected architectural historian. It was the only house in all of America built before the Revolution with the fan light. Now, let's look at a couple of these houses. These are sort of transition. A house this is New England early Georgian, from 1715 to say the 1740s. A typical salt box, but with classical pedimented doorway. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but you can see it, and it's a little clearer on the Griswold House, 1764 in Guilford, Connecticut. Again, a simple salt box. The Buckman Tavern in Lexington, Mass. Note the mansard roof, actually, with a classical Georgian doorway. And there's a little example of a half-round transom. And then an early transition period, which is very, very simple, except the hint of a classical detail over the front door. Now, the next slide also shows some examples of New England Georgian. Samuel Bernard House in Deerfield is on the upper left. The Wentworth Gardner House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire is a wonderful example. And then lower left is the Richard Darby House in Salem, Mass. And then a typical 5-bay with coins on the corners and elaborate entry doorway. So we're getting a little fancier now. And you'll continue to see this theme develop in the New England Georgian. Here's a typical 5-bay with a half-round transom light on the left. And then the house on the right is Henry Bosley House. It's also called the Longfellow House. It was built in Cambridge in about 1759, before the Revolution. And here's a example of a gambrel roof. Again, they're starting to introduce all these coins on the corner. Of course, it's a stone detail, but it's echoed in wood. And then again on the right, another gambrel roof. And that's sort of, you drive around New England and you see houses like that in the old houses, particularly the ones that are closer to the, with the exception of Deerfield, most of the houses along the seashore. Now, we have Georgian in the Delaware Valley, or the middle colonies, is also from 1715 to 1783, but it's a little different. And this goes again from the end of the Stuart reign and the beginning of the Georgian period to the Treaty of Paris, the official end of the Revolutionary War. Now, William Penn founded Pennsylvania in 1682. Quakers came up the Delaware Valley as early as 1650 and settled in western New Jersey and Delaware. The colonists were largely from the North Midlands, the Pennine region of England, and Penn came on the ship the Fortune in 1682. Interestingly, he never lived here. There was a tradition of stone construction in the counties that the majority of the Quaker settlers came from. So stone buildings with slate roofs were simply a continuation of prototypes that were set in the mother country. And you see the massing is typically symmetrical with center hall plan, the center of the facade often a cross gable, classical portico emphasizing the main entrance. That's strictly from Palladio. A wide range of types of roofs, hip, gambrel, and the doorways were paneled with transom lights above, usually rectangular, but sometimes half round. In the fenestration, the windows were double hung with, or sash windows, as they were called, 6/6, 6/9, or sometimes 9/6. They were never paired, as so often seen in colonial revival houses. Palladian windows were very common. The details, another thing about the stone, it was often much wider mortar joints than the ones we'd find in New England or particularly in the South. The details tended to be heavier than in the other colonies, but still strictly classical. External shutters began to appear, often paneled shutters on the ground floor windows and louvered blinds on the upper floor. Note that the lower units were often painted white and the upper ones dark green or black. This seems to be peculiar to Pennsylvania or the middle colonies. Note that the pent or pennis, common to Delaware Valley houses. It's a feature that in the North Midlands of Britain, so it's which is the origin of most of the Delaware Valley settlers. It's a very common giveaway, and if you look at the next slide, you'll see an example, several examples where the pent is incorporated. The one on the upper left is Pottsgrove. It's a beautifully preserved building. It was in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, and it was built about 1752. The Johnston House on the right is in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and that was about 1765 to 66 or 7. And again, there's the pendant. On the left, Cliveden, which is a very noted house with a number of Palladian pediment on the over the front door, at the roof level, and the sort of little, you can't see them very well, but they're little urns, and that's from Palladio's days. And then the building on the right is in Fairmount Park. It's Mount Pleasant. And the next slide shows a picture of Mount Pleasant from the back. And this design follows a Palladian 5-part composition but omits the standard hyphens that actually physically connect the dependencies to the main central block. And again, this is a wonderful example of Palladian details. And you can note the little balustrade at the very top. So now let's go to the south, go a little further south. And there we have, again, I remind you, from the 1715, 1783, from the end of the Stuart reign, the beginning of the Georgian period to the Treaty of Paris, official end of the Revolutionary War. The southern Georgian houses were not reflections of the late 18th century architecture in Britain. The classical Renaissance architecture begins with the early Stuart period when Inigo Jones, 1573 to 1652, designed Queen's House in Greenwich in 1620. And these examples served as precedent for 18th century Georgian colonial houses. It was always about a generational gap. That gap got closer and closer as time went on, but during this period, it was so what was Georgian in England became our federal in this country, and what was early Stuart became Georgian in this country. And the Great Fire of London consumed the city in 1666, 6 years after the restoration of Charles II. And Sir Christopher Wren, 1632 to 1723, was the architect chosen to rebuild it. Now here, the massing, the typical center hall plan with 5 bay divisions is the most common, but rules are made to be broken. Stratford Hall, the home of the Lee family, was a prime example. It was an H plan with Baroque clustered chimney, which is unique to this whole era and the whole period. Wonderful house. But generally the roof types are hip more often than in the Delaware Valley or New England, but all types of standard roofs are found throughout the South. The single panel door, often with rectangular transom length, classical entablatures with supporting pilasters or engaged half columns are very common. Typical double-hung sash windows with thick muntins are standard. Sometimes one sees finer glazing bars and larger panes, but most of the time those were later additions. It's true of Drayton Hall in the lower left, where the windows were really replaced during the Federal period and were not, originally they would have been very thick muntin bars, which are not mullions. A lot of people in the real estate business refer to them as mullions, but they're not, they're muntins. And mullions are the dividing structural element between windows. Anyway, more often brick with Flemish blonde. Some wood houses have survived. The ground floor was often raised above the grade in the South, and Palladian influence in the form of double porches, 5-part Palladian composition were common. That's Carter's Grove, famous Georgian house. It's interesting though, it was built about 1750 in James County, Virginia, James City County. The house was originally built as a 5-bay structure, 5 above and 4 below with a door in the middle is some term you sometimes hear. With a simple hip roof, but it was extensively remodeled in 1928 with extra windows and the 5 dormers. And Mount Airy is in Richmond County, Virginia, and it was 1758 or 59, somewhere around there. The south facade, there was a fire in 1844, and the pediment and eaves, unfortunately, were not properly restored. The inept details detracts from the house, and it's sad that the original details were not reconstructed. So other examples from this period in Annapolis, for example, there's the Chase House, 1769 or 70. And that's unusual in that it's 3-story, which sort of anticipates what we're going to see when we get into the Federal period after the Revolution. The Bryce House was about 1773, and the Paca House was roughly about the same time, 1760 sometime. But Annapolis is a wonderful place to look at this kind of architecture. You'll see on the next slide that the Upton Scott House, 1765, and there's a detail of the doorway of that house on the right, and a detail of the cornice detail of the of that doorway on the top of those two. And again, it reinforces what I said earlier on about only having the crown molding on the rake and never on the horizontal. The Hammond House was by a wonderful architect named William Buckland. The detail shows on the right, shows his mastery of proportion. And again, the Hammond House shows the 5-part composition and the pediment over the, emphasizing the front door. And now we go to a very, very interesting house, which everybody recognizes when they see a picture of it from the riverside, but not so often when they see this. But it's actually Mount Vernon, George Washington's house. And it was first built as a sort of generic farmhouse by George Washington's father. And that was back in 1735 or 36. And then it was remodeled in the Georgian style just before the Revolution. And note the asymmetry in that there's a stairway to the right of behind the front door there. So there's a little wider space between the door and the window that's adjacent to it. During the Revolution, actually, it took its final form. And it's a really wonderful thing. If you look very, very closely at it, you'll see that everything is off a little bit. For example, he had to honor the vertical pediment over the front door, but look where the windows are. The one on the right is tucked in just inside of the pediment, and the other one ends up right where the pediment ends up in the middle of the window. The cupola is off a little bit as well, and again, he followed the original floor plan and the original layout, so the door in the middle there is quite a distance from the window to the right. And one last thing about this building, the building on the left, which is of course added during the Revolution, and it looks like it's 2 stories, but it's not. That's all one super space inside. And it was a general all-purpose room. And when they gave banquets, they had trestle tables. George Washington would order a whole bunch of dining room chairs, fancy chairs, but never fancy tables, because they covered them with tablecloths. And when the dinner was over, they would staff would remove them all, and that's where they had their dances. So this brings us to the end of part 1. And part 2 was going to go, we're going to pick up from the early federal period from 1783, and we're going to go up to 1835. This is the period following the official end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 to the age of Jackson in the early 1830s. And there are 3 styles that we will cover in that next lecture or next part. The Federal, Neoclassical, and the Greek Revival. And with that, I thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you look forward to part 2.